follows an extract from my book Fête Fatale, available from Amazon. Chapter 8, Part 2. Maddox's enthusiasm was tempered slightly by the prospect of an intercom at the looming and definitely locked electric gates. Getting out of the car, he pushed the buzzer and waited for a response. "Name and business," crackled a male voice without ceremony. "Sergeant Maddox of Mossleigh Police. I'd like to speak to Mr. Jefferson, please." "Wait one moment." The buzzer snapped off and Maddox was left to wait again. He reflected on his first steps in criminal investigation. On second thought, he considered, "I'd like to" lacked the necessary authority. It suggested the possibility that his wishes rested on the pleasure of Jefferson and could necessarily be refused. That gave Jefferson control, and that wasn't right at all. He had the weight of the law behind him. He'd better change tack. He wasn't dealing with little old ladies now. The intercom buzzed into action again. "Jefferson here, what's your rank and business?" "My name is Sergeant Maddox and I'm here on behalf of DCI James of Winsford HQ. Your name has appeared in a current inquiry and I need to ask you a few general questions." That should do it, though it was perhaps a little cowardly to hide behind James's credentials. The intercom snapped off and Maddox was left to wait yet again. Before he could register annoyance, the gates began to open inwards. He jumped into the car and quickly drove through, as if he feared they would close before he was through. Once safely inside, he steadied his pace to take in his surroundings. He whistled softly to himself as he took in the view. Either side of the meandering driveway lay elegantly manicured gardens, and pristine flower beds displayed a riot of colour against the luscious green lawns. To the left, a little in the distance, a tennis court could be seen. It didn't look real, but seemed more like a TV set. The house rose up before him. If Maddox had known his architectural history, he would have seen that it was of Georgian design. Built of the expected sandstone appropriate to the period, it displayed the proportion and balance of the era in the symmetry of the many sash windows. The Greek inspiration behind the style was acknowledged in the simple Ionian columns that supported the triangular portico over the impressive front door. Maddox nevertheless clearly recognised that the house was tastefully built and, above all, impressive. The front door opened as Maddox pulled the car over to the side of the driveway and he met Jefferson on the doorstep. "Good morning, sir. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to ask you a few questions in connection with a man named John Barlow," said Maddox. He curbed a deep-seated desire to doff a non-existent cap and ask for directions to the servants' entrance. Jefferson rolled his eyes. "I knew that man would be nothing but trouble. You better come inside. I must say that I'm not very happy about you just turning up here. My wife is understandably jumpy after my brief holiday at Her Majesty's pleasure, and you can imagine the shock she got when the gardener starts yelling for me to tell me that the police are here. You could have telephoned me at work and asked me to come over to the station." "Would you have come?" "Of course I would. What do you think I'd do, run for the nearest airport? I was a little foolish once, but now I'm down as a potential fugitive. Good grief, you watch too much TV." Feeling somewhat abashed, Maddox apologised for his tactlessness. He could appreciate the secret of Jefferson's success. He certainly came across as the acme of respectability. Maddox was led into an opulent study. A large desk, probably responsible for the demise of a good chunk of endangered Amazonian rainforest, lay at an oblique angle and dominated the room. Rich burgundy leather chairs sat on the outskirts of the room in front of floor-to-ceiling bookcases. Quickly scanning the spines of some of the contents of the shelves, Maddox saw that the topics covered were wide and varied, ranging from art and history to classic literature and music. Unable to contain his curiosity, Maddox asked, "Have you read all of these?" Jefferson laughed. "Maybe not all of them from cover to cover, but I've certainly dipped into nearly all of them. The gardening and music books are my wife's. "So what's the matter with John Barlow? Is he in over his head?" asked Jefferson. "You could say that," said Maddox. "He's dead." Jefferson stood as still as the marble statue that stood on his windowsill for long seconds before turning to Maddox. "Well, I didn't expect you to say that. You'd better tell me all about it." "I think that really you'd better tell me. That's why I'm here. Your name is jotted down in John's diary on the page of the date that he died. He died at the fête. Did you see him when you were there?" "I was at the fête with my wife. She found the social stigma of me being in prison pretty tough, and she's found it even harder since I've come home. She's very sensitive, and the embarrassment has almost been too much for her. She has gradually been gaining confidence, and she said she'd like to go to the fête at Mossleigh. I was pleased that she would consider being seen with me again, and I tried to make sure that she had a good time, though I was getting heartily sick of knitting jams and cakes." "I see, sir, but that doesn't explain why your name should be written in John's diary." "No, you're quite right, it doesn't." Jefferson paused and seemed to be thinking what he should say next. He gave a deep sigh. "The answer to that question is simple, and yet may not be so simple." "Go on." Jefferson indicated that Maddox take a seat in one of the leather chairs, and he joined Maddox in an adjacent low armchair. "John Barlow called me at my office about 2 months ago. I run a sizable building company in Winsford and also have an office in Alderley. I can only assume that he'd heard of my misdemeanour and had tracked down my business contact details. He'd emailed a couple of times and then he called me on the telephone. I have to admit that I had originally had no intention of replying to his emails. When my secretary told me that he was on the line wanting to speak to me urgently, I decided to let her put the call through. I thought it was the best way to get rid of him in the end. He sounded pretty desperate, and he said that he really needed my advice on some property holdings he had. He seemed to think that I was the key to some criminal underworld. He was very melodramatic and wanted me to help him out. It was laughable, really. It was so seedy. However, if you're telling me that he's dead, then it's not so laughable, really, is it?" "Not really, no." "Can you tell me what was on his mind? Did he tell you what he needed help with? Did you ever meet with him?" Jefferson paused for a moment before answering. He shrugged his shoulders and continued. "I may as well tell you. It appears that I'm marked as a hardened criminal, and you'll just keep hounding me until you've got every last drop of my privacy. I don't want that for my wife's sake, so I'll do what I can to tell you what I know. But it's not very much, I'm afraid." Maddox smiled encouragingly and took out his notebook and pencil as Jefferson continued. "As you are aware, I'm sure, I stayed at Her Majesty's pleasure as a result of a brief dip in my moral conduct and a few nifty alterations on my tax returns relating to certain property investments. In some measure, John occupied a similar business world and held a small property portfolio with leases available in Greece and Spain. The property crash of recent years has hit us all hard, but you have to take the rough with the smooth in our line of business. You can't expect to ride the gravy train all the time. John Barlow had thought that he could and didn't like the prospect of a few bumpy years. Or I should probably say that he thought that his wife wouldn't like it. He begged me to meet him, and I could see that he was going to be a nuisance. The only way to deal with it was to meet with him and try and talk some sense into him." "And so you met him at the fête?" "Yes. He concocted this ridiculous cloak and dagger meeting behind the village hall for 2:30 that afternoon, and in the end, like a fool, I agreed. I tried to arrange a meeting with him in the office as we had done before, but he said that it couldn't wait. I knew I could easily slip off for half an hour without any trouble. That's ironic. I'm in trouble now, that's for sure." "I'm not so sure that we're looking for trouble yet, Mr. Jefferson, but it certainly is inconvenient for you. What did you discuss? I presume that he was alive when you went to meet him." "Of course he was alive. I wouldn't leave a chap like that and not tell anybody. He was alive, but I'm not so sure that he was alive and well. As we talked, he got progressively worse. He began to sweat and became more and more flushed and red in the face. In the end, I asked him what the matter was and offered to go and get help. He'd made quite a drama of our meeting, and I thought it was all getting a bit much for him. He told me that he'd be fine. He said he'd got diabetes and just needed a sweet cup of tea and a piece of toast, and then he'd be as right as rain. He assured me that he was quite used to the symptoms and he'd soon be back to his usual self. He was so sure about it. I didn't think that he was ill enough to die, or I'd have insisted upon getting help. What did you discuss during your meeting? Was he in dire straits and under a severe burden of stress? There was nothing unusual about his situation. We were all in the same boat, and his dilemma was only to a small degree, relatively speaking. In short, his income was down and his expenses were up. The Euro crash meant that tenants couldn't pay their rent or weren't taking on new leases, whilst the Greek government was trying to save its own economy by raising property tax to increasingly dizzy heights. The Spanish tourism trade was also falling off. Brits weren't holidaying abroad so much as the cost of living in Spain had risen, so holidays were becoming more and more expensive. The tenants of the bars he owned were struggling for business and were falling behind on their rent. How did he expect you to help in all of this? What could you do about it? You could hardly negotiate with the Greek tax authorities, could you? Certainly not. I don't know whether John thought that because I'd been in prison I'd got daring contacts. He'd got very exaggerated ideas about my illicit past. His situation wasn't as bad as he made out. I suggested that he tighten his belt and ride it out like the rest of us. I told him that if he was feeling the pinch too much, he could convert some of his assets by selling them. I know that property wasn't moving in Greece, or maybe even in Spain, but he could easily ease his budget by selling what he had in France. What did he say to your advice? He said that he didn't want to let his wife down if he could help it. You know, the whole alpha male thing. He wanted my so-called underworld contacts to help him. I told him that I didn't have such contacts and that he was foolish to look on these things as failure. This was business. If he'd never had to experience this before, he had done well. Extremely well. You know, he actually laughed and suggested I speak to his wife. What did you say to that? I told him to stop being an idiot and to stop making mountains out of molehills. I also told him to look at my recent holiday in prison as a warning. Surely that's what his wife would like least of all. He just laughed again. But after that he seemed to take notice of what I'd said, and I really thought I'd got through to him. He seemed to pick up a bit after that. He really did. So you thought he seemed well enough when you left him? I thought he looked tired and older, resigned, if you see what I mean. He knew he'd have to ride it out like I am. He didn't look too well, but he insisted he'd be fine once he'd had a drink and a bite to eat. He was adamant about that and didn't like me fussing. I believed him when he said he was okay. He seemed so unconcerned about himself. I'm sorry that I was wrong about that, but I could only take his word, couldn't I? I understand. So, in a nutshell, you say that he was making a dramatic fuss about an economic inconvenience and, after speaking to you, he seemed to understand that foolish attempts to get around it were futile. You're saying that his situation wasn't critical and hardly really embarrassing, but that he felt it too keenly. Perhaps knowing that others were in the same boat encouraged him, and he just had to take the knocks like you all did. Have I understood correctly, sir? I should say that's about it. I think he told me everything. He was disconcertingly transparent. I felt so sorry for him that I offered to help him as much as I could. You could speak to his accountant to check what he told me, but I think he was telling me the truth. I wouldn't have said his situation was desperate. Maddox stood up to leave. He extended his right hand to shake hands. Thank you for your help, sir. I'm sorry that I've unsettled your wife. If I need to speak to you again, how would you prefer me to contact you? I'd appreciate it if you'd call me at the office. If I'm not there, my secretary will be able to get hold of me most of the time, and I'll get straight back to you." Jefferson walked over to his desk and picked up a business card which he gave to Maddox. "Thank you again for your time and help. Of course, you know that if you think of anything at all which might help me, you can call me at the station." Maddox drove back to the station in a very sedate manner. His boss had warned him against driving too fast, and so he drove slowly. The fact that he took the long, picturesque route back hardly entered into the equation. For the full book of Fête Fatale, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.